People ask me sometimes, the ones who have heard the story secondhand, who got it filtered through dock bar gossip, and the kind of embellishment that happens when a tale travels across 3 transit lanes, they ask me if I knew right away. If I opened that crate and felt something change in me, some seismic thing, some calling. I tell them no. I tell them I was angry. I tell them I was calculating freight weight and insurance risk, and the very specific kind of trouble a contraband manifest brings down on a medic who has already used up most of her goodwill with the Meridian Freight Authority. That is the honest answer. The seismic thing came later, and it came slow, the way cold comes into a ship when the insulation on an outer hull panel starts to fail. Not a wall of it, just a gradual, total permeation until one day you realize your hands haven't been warm in weeks and you've stopped noticing. But I am getting ahead of myself. My name is Sierra Vance. I was, at the time this happened, 41 years old, a licensed combat medic running an unlicensed side arrangement with a freight hauler called the Ardent Passage, a Tarkov-class bulk carrier that had seen better decades, crewed by 11 people I trusted to varying degrees, and captained by a man named Das Caroline who I trusted completely, which is to say not at all but at least consistently. We ran medical supplies. The licensed kind went in the hold manifest. The unlicensed kind, the antibiotics that the outer corridor settlements couldn't afford through proper channels, the surgical kits, the broad-spectrum antivirals, went in the secondary hold behind a false bulkhead that Das had installed 8 years before I came aboard, and which the Meridian Authority had inspected 14 times without finding. I was not proud of everything I did on that ship. I was not ashamed of the medical supplies. The outer corridor settlements had children in them, and children get sick, and I had seen what happens to a settlement that can't afford a licensed supply run when the fever season comes. So I ran contraband medicine for poor people, and I slept fine. What I did not run and had never run and had told Das with clarity on the day I signed on was anything living, no cargo with a pulse. That was my line. Das had agreed to it in the way he agreed to most things, a nod that meant he had heard the words and filed them somewhere below the part of his brain that made freight decisions. I should have asked for it in writing. I know that now. We had made port at Calvern Station, a fuel and resupply depot at the edge of the outer corridor, running 3 days behind schedule because one of the drive coils had thrown a fault code that turned out to be nothing, but had taken 18 hours to confirm. I was in the medical bay reviewing inventory. We were running low on epinephrine. I needed to source more before we hit the next settlement run, when my comm unit pinged and it was Das, saying there was a crate in secondary hold 7 that hadn't been on the manifest when he loaded it, and that he thought I should look at it before he decided what to do. I remember the exact weight of that sentence, the careful neutrality of it. Das was not a careful speaker by nature. When Das was being careful, it meant something was already wrong. I went. Secondary hold 7 was at the stern, past the junction where the scrubber units make that particular grinding noise, a harmonic in the 3rd ventilation stack that the engineers had been going to fix for 2 years, and the crate was standard cargo spec, gray polymer, sealed, with a manifest tag I didn't recognize. I ran the tag through my handheld. It came back registered to a freight broker called Yavel Transit Partners out of the Eshari Orbital, and when I pulled the broker's credentials, they were valid but flagged. 2 Ministry of Labor violation notices, and a pending investigation from the Corridor Trade Commission that I had no details on because the details were sealed. I stood there for a moment. Then I cracked the seal. The smell hit me first. Not bad, not decay, a dry, faintly mineral smell, like dust and something faintly metallic, and underneath it something warmer that I would come to know well. Then I got the lid open all the way, and there was a child in the crate. A Kathai child. I knew the species by sight. I'd done 6 months at a refugee processing station on Murthai's IV during the corridor resettlement push, and there were Kathai families in those queues, and the children had a particular look. Small even by child standards, gray-skinned, large-framed bones that showed through the skin in a way that read as fragile until you understood the Kathai skeleton was actually extraordinarily dense. And eyes. The eyes were what you noticed. Enormously wide, pale amber, with a pupil that expanded to nearly the full iris in low light. They caught everything. They held it. This child was sitting in the crate with her knees drawn to her chest and both hands flat on the bottom panel. And she looked at me with those eyes and did not make a sound. She was wearing what had once been a ceremonial robe. I learned the significance of that later, when I knew more about Kathai garments and what they meant. But at the time, I only registered that it was made of good fabric, embroidered at the hem with metallic thread, torn at one shoulder, and so much too large for her that it had been twisted and tucked around her like a rough cocoon. She was holding a small carved figure in one fist, a four-legged animal, I thought, though the carving was worn smooth and it was hard to be certain. Her face was utterly still. I said in the 3 words of Kathai I actually knew, "I am safe." She said nothing. I said it again, because that seemed like the right response to silence, and then I thought better of using up a third of my Kathai vocabulary when I had no idea what else I was going to need it for. So I stopped and just looked at her and she looked at me. Then I turned around and went to find Das. What followed was the conversation I should have had with him 8 years earlier, with the part about putting the agreement in writing. He had not known the child was in the crate. That much I believed. Das was greedy and he was careless, and he was the kind of man who rationalized the difference between knowing a thing and choosing not to ask. But he was not the kind of man who would have knowingly loaded a child into the secondary hold and then sent his medic to check on it like it was a cargo dispute. He was pale when I told him. He had the good grace to look sick. The crate, as best as we could reconstruct it in the next hour, had been loaded by a dock worker at Calvern Station, who had presumably been paid to not look too carefully at the paperwork. The Yavel Transit Partners tag was a shell. The real ownership, buried 3 layers down in the freight database, traced back to an operator name that appeared on 2 corridor authority watch lists under the category of unregistered human and non-human trafficking. There was a child in my secondary hold who had been loaded onto a slaver's manifest. I went back to the hold and I sat down on the deck outside the open crate and I said to her, in my limited Kathai, the one word I knew for question, "Name." She looked at me. The amber eyes were very steady. She did not answer. I found out later, weeks later, when I had managed to obtain a translation package through a contact at the Murthai's IV station, that the word I had used was not quite the Kathai word for name. It was closer to the word for title or designation, the kind of name you give something or someone over whom you have authority, not the word you use to ask a person what they are called. I had, in my ignorance, asked her what she was designated. In the context of a crate on a slaver's manifest, the precision of that error was not small. She had been in that crate for somewhere between 36 and 48 hours. I could tell by the dehydration and by the state of the small waste management liner the traffickers had installed in the bottom, a detail that told me, more than anything else, that this had been planned and that there had been others before her. Someone had thought about logistics. Someone had done this more than once. I gave her water, not quickly, not all at once, slowly, from a canteen I had in my kit, watching her take small sips and let each one settle before the next, the way I'd learned to rehydrate patients who had been without fluids for too long. She drank the first quarter of the canteen before she stopped and looked at me, and then she held the canteen out, offering it back, like she didn't want to take more than she was owed. I put my hand under hers and pushed the canteen gently back toward her. She drank the rest. I told Das that I was keeping her in the medical bay until we could get her to a Kathai contact point, and that if he had any objection to that, he could file it somewhere I didn't have to hear it. He didn't object. He looked at the canteen in her hands, and he looked at the crate, and he nodded once and walked out of the hold. She walked with me to the medical bay on her own feet. Small, careful steps, the robe dragging, the carved figure still in her fist. She looked at everything. She took it all in with those wide amber eyes, the corridor walls, the scrubber unit junction, the medical bay door, and she said nothing. I set up a bunk for her. I ran the basic scans I could run without asking her to consent to anything invasive. I wasn't going to put sensors on a child who couldn't consent without frightening her, so I worked from observation, and from the initial readings the proximity scanner gave without contact. She was thin. She was fatigued in the specific way that looks like calm to people who don't know the difference. Her core temperature was 3/4 of a degree below the Cathai nominal, which could mean she was running cold from the crate conditions, or could mean other things that I was going to watch for. No injuries I could see. No bruising. Whoever had loaded her had wanted her undamaged. The thought of that sat in me like swallowed metal. I made her a nutrient mixture. The Cathai metabolic profile wasn't in my standard formulary, but I'd kept the notes from my time at Murthai's IV, and I knew enough to avoid the proteins that would cause a reaction and to keep the electrolyte balance in range. She ate it slowly from a bowl, sitting on the edge of the bunk, the robe pooled around her, holding the carved figure in her free hand and setting it down on the blanket beside her with evident care before she picked up the bowl. When she finished, she set the bowl down and picked the figure back up, and then she looked at me sitting across the bay, and she nodded. It was the first communication. I don't know what it meant precisely. I took it as acknowledgement, as something having been received. I said good night. She lay down and she closed her eyes, and I sat in the chair by the door, and I did not go to sleep for a long time. Those were the first 2 days. There were 11 people on the Ardent Passage, and not all of them were comfortable with what I had brought into the medical bay. Pell, the senior cargo engineer, knocked on the bay door the morning of day 2 and told me politely that he thought we should have reported the crate to the station authority at Calvern before we left, and that carrying the contents put us all at risk. He was not wrong about the risk. I told him I had heard him, and I thanked him for coming to me directly, and I told him we were past the point where the station option was useful. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and looked at the child sitting on the bunk, and the child looked at him with the full weight of those amber eyes, and Pell looked away first. He left without saying anything else. He came back that evening with a set of thermal socks he'd gotten from his own kit, which were too big but the right general shape, and he set them outside the bay door without knocking, and I found them when I went to check the corridor. The child wore them the next morning. She had pulled them on herself, and they bunched at the ankle and were slightly comical, and she did not appear to notice or to care. She sat at the viewport with her feet in Pell's thermal socks and watched the drive wash, and I went about my inventory work, and neither of us talked. We were, I suppose, learning the shape of the silence we were going to share. What came next was the Yavel Transit Partners problem. We had cleared Calvern Station by the time I had the full picture of the manifest, and we were 14 hours into the transit lane toward the Austrian waypoint when our communications board logged an inquiry from a freight broker asking about a delayed secondary hold crate. Das handled the reply. He told them the crate had been offloaded in error and would require a routing correction. The broker went quiet for 18 hours. Then they sent a second inquiry, this one with a case number attached and a notation from the Calvern Station Dock Authority, and the notation was polite and procedural in the way that things are polite and procedural when there is money behind them. Das came to me. He explained the inquiry. He explained that there was a realistic possibility that whoever owned the manifest, the layers he'd stripped back were not, he said, encouraging, would escalate to direct contact, and that direct contact from this type of operator tended to have a physical component. I asked him how long until the next junction point, where we could request a corridor authority intercept. He said 4 days, if we maintained standard transit speed. I said to push the drive. He said that would make us 3 days. I said 3 days was better than 4. He did not argue. The child spent the first days in the medical bay the way a small animal spends the first days in an unfamiliar shelter, watching everything, eating when I put food in front of her, sleeping in the brief heavy way of the exhausted, and being awake and watchful again almost immediately after. She learned where the water was. She learned the sounds of the ship, the scrubber harmonic, the drive cycling through its pressure check every 6 hours, the particular knock that the forward cargo bay made when the temperature differential was more than 8 degrees. I watched her learn these things. The second time the drive cycled, she didn't look up from the blanket she was examining. She had filed it. She explored the medical bay with methodical attention. She didn't touch anything without looking at me first, and when I nodded she would pick up the object and turn it over in her hands, the scanner probe, the sealed packet of gauze, the small potted plant I kept on the shelf above the secondary bunk, which she held for a long time before setting it back very precisely where it had been. She had manners. Careful, deliberate, entirely instinctive manners, the kind that are not taught so much as absorbed from an environment where they matter. She did not speak. I ran the translation package every morning, practicing the Cathay vocabulary I was acquiring slowly, imperfectly, with the particular incompetence of an adult brain learning a tonal language with 4 registers my voice couldn't always produce cleanly. I learned the correct word for name. I learned the words for safe and for mine and for not yours. I learned the words for eating and sleeping, and the word that roughly translated as will you for requests. I practiced in the medical bay quietly when she was awake. She would listen. She gave nothing away, but she was listening. The third day I found her standing at the small viewport in the aft wall of the bay, a viewport I rarely opened because it looked directly into the drive exhaust wash, which wasn't interesting visually, but she had found the shutter and she had opened it herself, and she was looking out at the wash of light and particle stream from the drive manifold. I stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment, her face against the glass, the carved figure in her hand. I said in Cathay, the better word this time, "What are you called?" She didn't answer. I said, "I am Sira." She said nothing, but she turned and looked at me with the full weight of those eyes, and she did not look through me, and that was something. The ship was managing the tension in its own way. Riel, who cooked for the crew and ran the galley stores, had started leaving a small portion of the nutrient mix in a covered dish outside the medical bay with a note that said which meal it was, breakfast, midday, evening, and the portions were exactly right, which told me she had looked up the Cathay metabolic requirements herself. She never said anything about it. I never said anything about it to her. That was how the ardent passage worked. We handled things obliquely, at a distance, in the way of people who had been in close quarters long enough to know that direct acknowledgement of a generous act sometimes made it harder to repeat. The Yavel Transit Partners problem escalated on day 4. The communication came not through the freight board this time, but through the emergency hailing band, a Meridian Authority channel that required a registered vessel ID to access, which meant whoever was behind this had access to registered IDs, which meant they had money and reach and people with licenses. The message was clipped and formal, identifying itself as a routine manifest reconciliation inquiry from a Corridor Trade Commission registered agent, requesting confirmation of secondary hold inventory, and requesting that we hold position for a compliance check at the next junction point. It was a very good forgery. I only knew it was a forgery because I had run the Commission's agent registry before we left Calvern, and I knew that no agent with that ID existed. DOS pushed the drive to 87%. The engineers didn't like it. The drive didn't like it. I didn't care. On the same day, the child ate breakfast and then went to the shelf where I kept the translation tablet, and she picked it up and brought it to me, and set it on the work table in front of where I was sitting. She stood and looked at me. I opened the tablet to the Kathai language interface. She pointed to a symbol. It was the symbol for a word that meant approximately, the one who holds the thread. It was a Kathai relational term, not a name, but a role description, the way Kathai children addressed a particular kind of trusted adult in their culture. An adult who had been given charge of their safety in a specific, formal sense. I hadn't known that when I'd loaded the translation package. I read the definition 3 times. Then I looked at her. She was still watching me. I put my finger on the symbol and said it aloud in Kathai, badly, probably with the wrong tonal register on the second syllable. She made a sound. It was the first sound she had made that wasn't a necessary physical sound, not swallowing, not the small exhalation of sleep, and it took me a moment to understand that she was correcting my pronunciation. She said it again, the right way. I said it again, following her. She said it a third time. I said it a third time. She nodded. She picked up the translation tablet and carried it back to its shelf with that same deliberate care. And then she sat down on her bunk and picked up the carved figure and turned it in her hands. I sat for a long time at the work table after that. I was thinking about the weight of a relational term, about a child who had been in a crate on a slaver's manifest for 40-some hours, choosing, in whatever calculus she was running in that large and careful brain, to extend a thread to the person who had opened the crate. I was not a parent. I had never particularly wanted to be one. I had spent my adult life being useful to people, and then leaving when the job was done, which is a kind of detachment I had mistaken for independence until that moment, sitting at the work table, with the Kathai relational term sitting in my ears. I am not going to milk this. It was what it was, and I knew what it was, and I did not let myself mistake it for something else. She was extending a functional bond because her species did that, because it was survival behavior, because she needed someone to be the thread holder, and I was the one who had opened the crate and given her water. That was the honest accounting. And it was also true that sitting at that work table, I felt the full weight of it land on me, and I did not flinch from the weight. And I think that was the moment I understood that I was going to fight for her with everything I had. The fake authority intercept message came on day 5. Another forgery, different approach, this one claiming to be a medical cargo audit, requesting that our medics submit hold inventory to a compliance portal. The portal link was a phishing construct. I didn't click it. I sent back a templated compliance acknowledgement and reported the portal link to the actual Corridor Authority cybersecurity unit with a brief note explaining the situation. The brief note was not so brief. I included everything: the manifest, the Yavel broker trace, the layered ownership, the crate, the child, the forged communications. I sent it in triplicate to 3 separate authority divisions and 1 copy each to 2 advocacy organizations I knew from my Murthai's IV time. Then I sent one more message. To a Kathai liaison at the Austrian waypoint, a woman named Coordinator Ven Ashali, whose address I had from an aid organization contact list that I'd kept even though it was 3 years old and she might have moved on. I described the child. I described the ceremonial robe. I described the carved figure. I asked if she could pass the description to anyone who might know who was missing a child. I went back to the medical bay. The child was sitting at the viewport again, the shutter open, watching the drive wash. I sat down in the chair beside her and we watched it together, the particle stream, the slow wheel of distant stars behind it. After a while she leaned slightly and her shoulder touched my arm and she didn't move away. I sat with that. I did not move either. I kept my attention on the viewport and the stars turning slowly in the exhaust wash, and I kept my breathing even. And after a while she fell asleep against my arm with the carved figure in both hands, and I stayed in the chair, not moving, while the ship ran and the drive cycled and the stars wheeled, because she was asleep and it did not seem like the right moment to leave. Days 6 and 7 were the worst. The operators behind the manifest had apparently decided that the forgeries weren't working and had switched to a different approach, a physical approach. We picked up a tail on our sensor board on the morning of day 6, a small craft, courier class, fast, running at the edge of our sensor range. They weren't trying to intercept. They were documenting our position for someone else. DAS identified the transponder signature as a registration type used by unaffiliated contractors in the outer freight lanes, which was the polite term for the kind of independent operators who didn't ask about the nature of the cargo. I did not tell the child there were people following us. I did not tell her anything had changed. I fed her and I ran through Cathay vocabulary with her, and in the evenings, when the watch rotation meant the ship was quieter, I read to her from a tablet. I had no Cathay materials on board, so I read her the maintenance logs for the drive system, which sounds absurd, but I had found that reading aloud in an even voice, and having her follow along on the tablet while I read seemed to be something she found useful. She would track the words with her finger. She was learning our written language, I realized, or at least learning to recognize the shape of it, systematically, quietly, on her own initiative. I gave her a notebook, a physical one from the supply locker. I gave her a stylus. She looked at both for a long moment and then she took them and she set them on the shelf above her bunk with the carved figure. She didn't use them that day. On the following morning the notebook had markings in it, careful, precise, repeated. The same Cathay symbol over and over, each repetition more refined than the last, like she was practicing a thing until she owned it. The symbol was the one for, the one who holds the thread. I did not comment on it. I put her breakfast on the work table and went to check in with DAS about the tail. The tail had gotten closer. 60% of standard intercept range, DAS said. They were waiting for us to slow down at the waypoint junction, which we would have to do to make the transit lane change. There was a 30-minute window there where a courier-class craft, if it had the right equipment and the right intent, could run a forced boarding under the cover of a routine inspection claim. I asked DAS what the ship carried for defense. He listed the things. They were not impressive. We had a pulse array for debris deflection that could be modified for a deterrent pulse. It wouldn't stop a purpose-built boarding craft, but it would make them think about it. We had 2 suits of EVA armor in the forward locker that would stop 1 round from a light rail gun. We had whatever the crew had brought aboard privately, which in my case was a compact frame automatic that I had owned since I left the Corps and kept serviced, but had not fired in 14 months. I told DAS to let me worry about the boarding scenario. He looked at me in that long-suffering way he had when he knew he was about to let me do something that was going to be a problem. That evening Pell came to me again. Not to complain this time. He came with Riel and a 3rd crew member, Savik, who ran the sensor array, and they told me they had talked among themselves and they had decided they were with me. Those were the exact words. We are with you. I looked at the 3 of them in the corridor outside the medical bay, and I did not say the things that came to mind, which were things about risk and professional responsibility, and the fact that none of them had signed on for this. I just nodded. They went back to their posts and I went back into the bay. The child was awake, sitting cross-legged on the bunk with the notebook in her lap. She looked at me when I came in. I sat down in the chair and I told her in my imperfect Cathay that there were people who wanted to find her, and that I was not going to let them, and that I needed her to understand that if she heard the alarm tone, I showed her the alarm panel, the tone, the light. She needed to get into the secondary wall locker and close the door and not open it until I opened it. I showed her the locker, I showed her the inside, I showed her the latch. She listened to all of this with absolute attention. She looked at the locker, she looked at me. She said, in Cathay, the words I recognized as the safe and not yours set, and then she said something else that my vocabulary wasn't quite up to. And when I checked the tablet later, I found it was a phrase that meant approximately, I know you will. I stood there in the medical bay with that translation in my head, and I thought about what it costs a child to extend that kind of trust. What it takes. What it means that she had been in a crate for 48 hours, and she had walked out of it, and she had given me that word, the thread. And now she was telling me she knew I would. I checked my weapon. I checked it again. I made sure the locker latch was smooth. The Waypoint Junction came on day 7, early ship morning. The courier craft made its approach on schedule. They filed a routine inspection claim, registration number matching a legitimate inspection contractor out of the Waypoint Authority, another forgery, but a better one than the earlier ones, and good enough to require us to slow and receive. They sent 2 people aboard. I met them in the forward cargo bay with Das and 2 of the crew, and I watched the way they moved, the way they checked corners before they entered spaces, the way their eyes went to the walls and the secondary doors rather than to Das's face while he talked, and I understood what they were and I understood what this was. They were not inspectors. They were retrieval. The senior one was a Vethani male, tall, in legitimate-looking inspector credentials, with a vest that fit too well across the shoulders for a desk worker. He asked Das about the secondary hold inventory with the specific confidence of someone who already knows the answer and wants to watch you choose what you're going to say. Das said there was no discrepancy in the secondary hold inventory. The Vethani said they had information suggesting an unmanifested cargo item. I said from where I was standing that they were welcome to inspect the secondary hold and they would find it as filed. I said this looking at his face and not his credentials. I said it with a particular quality of stillness that I had learned in the Corps, in the years when I had been a medic embedded with units, where the work required you to hold yourself very level while you assessed threat. He assessed me back, he was good at it, he decided something. He said they would need to inspect the medical bay as well. I said the medical bay was under medical confidentiality protocols and would require a corridor authority warrant. He said he had a corridor authority authorization. I asked to see the registration number. He gave me one. I ran it on my handheld. It came back as a real registration. I checked that twice, but assigned to an inspector who was currently, according to the authority's public deployment log, in a completely different transit lane on the other side of the corridor. The registration was real. The person holding it was not the person it belonged to. I said, this authorization is fraudulent. The assigned inspector is in corridor lane 7. This is corridor lane 3. I'm going to need you to accompany me to the bridge to file a correction notice. The Vethani looked at me for a long time. Then he looked at Das. Das had the kind of face that didn't move much, and it was not moving now. Then the Vethani looked back at me and he made a decision I could see him making. The calculation, the odds assessment, the awareness that whatever they thought they were going to find here was not worth the complication of what would follow if they forced it on a vessel that was, conspicuously, not complying. He looked briefly at the door that led to the aft section, where the medical bay was. I watched his eyes do that and I kept my own face level, and then he looked at my right hand, and then he made his decision. He said they would return with the appropriate documentation. He said it with the professional flatness of someone accepting a delay but not a defeat. They left the ship. Das said once the airlock cycled, that bought us something. I said, it bought us the rest of today and maybe tomorrow morning. I went to the medical bay. The child was in the locker. I opened the door. She came out immediately, quietly, the carved figure in her hand, and she stood and looked at me and I looked at her, and neither of us said anything for a moment. Then she went and sat on her bunk, and she picked up the notebook, and she made a mark in it. I didn't see what the mark was until later. The Austrian waypoint took 14 more hours to reach. Das pushed the drive to 91%, which the engineers were vocal about, and I told them to forward their concerns to me, and I would address them after we made the waypoint. They forwarded their concerns. I did not address them. Coordinator Ven Ashali had replied to my message. She had replied 12 hours after I sent it, which told me she was still at the waypoint or had been reachable through the forwarding, and her reply was brief and careful and asked for 3 specific details: the embroidery pattern on the robe's hem, the number of limbs on the carved figure, and whether the child had a small mark behind her left ear. I described the embroidery as best I could and sent a photograph of it. I said the carved figure appeared to have 4 limbs and a long neck, and a particular quality of finish on the legs that suggested age. I went and looked behind the child's left ear while she was sitting at the viewport quietly, in the way you look at someone without making a production of it, and yes, a small mark, darker than the surrounding skin, a slight deliberate shape to it. I described it, I sent the message. Ashali's second reply came 6 hours before we reached the waypoint, and it was not brief. It was 3 paragraphs of Kathai naming conventions and kinship structure, and the meaning of the ceremonial robe that I had understood only in the barest outline, and a paragraph that told me who the child was, or who they thought she was, and what her name was. And that if what I described was accurate, there were people who had been looking for her for 61 days, and that the description of the mark and the robe and the animal figure matched an account that had been on the Kathai missing persons network since the day she disappeared. Her name. I held that information for the rest of the transit. I thought about using it. I thought about saying it aloud in the medical bay and watching what happened. I thought about the word for, the one who holds the thread in the notebook, practiced in that careful handwriting. I didn't use it. The name wasn't mine to use. It was hers, and the people who would say it properly, with the right tones, in the right context, in the language it belonged to, were at the waypoint, and we were going to them, and my job was to get there. The courier craft made one more approach, 8 hours from the waypoint. They were bolder this time, closer, pushing up to 30% of intercept range, and they broadcast a freight ban challenge that was not a forgery but was a claim of damage liability, alleging that an item in our hold had been wrongfully diverted from a legal manifest. The language was careful. They had spent the hours since the boarding attempt on the paperwork. I replied to the broadcast personally. I identified myself by name and core certification number, which I had not used in 3 years but which was still active because I had never resigned my reserve classification. I stated that the vessel was transporting a minor in protective custody under the Corridor Child Protection Act, which was a real law with real teeth, and that any further attempt to interfere with the vessel's transit would be logged as interference with a protected minor, which carried a Corridor Authority mandatory response statute. I stated the statute number. I stated the provision. Then I stated, without statute number because there wasn't one, that I had been a combat medic for 17 years and that I was familiar with how this kind of situation ended, and that I was recommending, from professional experience, that they turn their craft around. They ran a parallel course for another 2 hours, then they fell back. Das came on the comm and said, 93% on the drive. I said, it can take it for 2 more hours. He said, it can probably take it for 2 more hours. I said, then let's find out. The Austrian waypoint was a standard deep transit station, old Corridor Authority construction, gray and functional, and it was the most welcome thing I had ever seen on a sensor board. We made the approach lane and I watched our tail fall further back, past the sensor shadow of the waypoint's gravity anchor, and I sat in the medical bay and I breathed. The child was sitting across from me, the notebook in her lap. She had been awake since I took the comm broadcast and she had listened to it. The medical bay comm was open and she had heard my voice on the channel, formal and measured, and she had not reacted to any of it in a visible way. She had gone on working in the notebook, slow and careful, the stylus moving with deliberate purpose. When I set the comm down, she looked at me, and I said in Kathai the word for close, as in, we are close now. We are nearly there. She looked at the viewport. Then she nodded once and went back to the notebook. Coordinator Ven Ashali met us at the docking bay. She was a Kathai woman in her 50s, taller than most of the humans on the dock, with the wide amber eyes that I had been looking at for 8 days, and a particular quality of contained composure that I recognized from Murthai's IV. The composure of someone who had been in the business of finding lost things for a long time and had learned to hold the hope level until they were certain. She was not alone. There were 2 others with her, a male and a female, and I recognized the relationship in the way they held themselves before Ashali said anything, the way they stood slightly too still, the way they were watching the airlock with every part of their attention. I had the child behind me, at my left. She was wearing the robe, which I had cleaned and done what I could with, and she had the carved figure in her hand. She had been quiet since we docked. She had been watching the airlock with the same quality of attention. The 2 figures on the dock were watching it from the other side. I stepped to the side. The 2 figures moved forward, not rushing, not the way emotion wants you to rush, but with a deliberate, controlled step that cost them something to keep controlled. And the child, she made a sound. Low, sustained, not a word in any language I had learned in 8 days, but I felt it in my chest. The female figure knelt down to her level, and the child crossed the dock in 4 steps, 4 small, careful steps, and was held. I stood back. And I watched. And Ashali stood beside me, and she was very quiet, and I was very quiet, and the dock around us had gone still in the way that spaces sometimes go still when something in them is too heavy for noise. After a while Ashali said in our language, "She is who we thought she was. The figure is her grandfather's. The mark is a family mark given at the first naming ceremony." A pause. "She was taken from a resettlement convoy. It has been 67 days. I said, "She was in a sealed crate for 48 hours before I found her." Ashali said, "I know your report was thorough." I said she didn't speak for all 8 days, not a word. Ashali said, "That is not uncommon." Then more quietly, "The Kathai have a word for silence that is not absence. It means something closer to waiting, held breath, the space before something begins." I watched the child with the 2 adults, the female holding her and the male sitting beside them both on the dock floor, and there was a quality to the watching that I could not have explained then and probably can't explain now. She was complete in a way she hadn't been in the medical bay. Not that she had been incomplete, she had been fully herself every moment of those 8 days. But there is a kind of completion that only exists in the presence of the right people, and it was present now, and I was watching it. I was not sad. I want to be clear about that. I had not let myself confuse the thread with something it wasn't, and when it was done I was not sad. I was something else, a feeling that doesn't have a clean name in any language I know, the feeling of a thing having been handled right, a weight set down in the correct place. Das was somewhere behind me, making arrangements with the waypoint authority. The corridor authority intercept was already in process. The data I had sent had been enough, and there were 2 official vessels being routed toward the courier craft's last known position. The Yavel Transit Partners' paperwork was someone else's problem now, and it was going to be a thorough problem for them. I started to turn back toward the airlock. And the child spoke. Not a word in Kathai. Not in any language I had been learning in 8 days of imperfect study with a translation tablet. She said it in our language, in the flat vowels of the Cargolane standard that she had heard me use for 8 days, in the careful diction of someone who has been listening to a thing for weeks and has turned it over and refined it and decided when to use it. She said my name. Just that, just the one word. Her voice was thin and precise, the pronunciation careful, the same quality as the mark she made in the notebook practiced until she owned it. She was looking at me across the dock with those wide amber eyes, the carved figure in her hand, the female adult still holding her, and she said my name. I stood very still. Then I said, in Kathai, with the right tonal register, finally, because I had spent 8 days getting it right, the word for the one who holds the thread. She nodded once. Then she turned back to the female adult, and the female adult stood, and they walked toward the interior of the waypoint station, and the male figure followed, and Ashali said something quietly in Kathai that I didn't catch, and then they were gone. I went back to the ship. I went to the medical bay. The bunk was made. She had made it that morning, the same way she made it every morning, with a deliberate precision that was entirely her own. The notebook was on the shelf above the bunk. She had left it. I picked it up. I opened it to the last page she had used. She had drawn the ship. The ardent passage from memory, with whatever she had been able to see of its exterior through the viewports, and whatever her mind had reconstructed from 8 days inside it. She had drawn it carefully, with the particular observational precision that I had watched her apply to everything she touched. The scrubber unit junction, the drive manifold seen from the medical bay viewport, the work table, the plant on the shelf above the secondary bunk. Pell's thermal socks, folded and placed at the end of the bunk with a precision that made something move in me when I recognized what they were. And on the final page, underneath the drawing of the ship, she had written one thing in our alphabet, in the letters she had learned by watching me read the maintenance logs aloud. In the written language she had taught herself from observation in 8 days, in the careful hand I had watched practicing in the margins. It was my name. Just that. I stood in the medical bay of the ardent passage at the Austrian waypoint with the notebook in my hands, and I looked at my name in that careful handwriting, and I thought about a child in a crate who had walked out of it and given a stranger the word for the one who holds the thread. I thought about 8 days of transit lane that felt, in the architecture of memory, like much longer, the way some stretches of time are denser than their length suggests, packed with a weight that compresses them into something more solid than calendar days. I thought about the weight of a canteen being pushed back toward me, and the weight of it being pushed back the other direction. I thought about Pell's thermal socks. I thought about Riel's careful meal portions. I thought about 3 people standing in a corridor saying, "We are with you." I have told this story a few times since. Not the embellished version, the dock bar version, the one that circulates with the wrong details and the wrong number of days, and the dramatic additions that tend to accumulate around a story about a child on a slaver's manifest. I've told the true version, the one I've just told now, to people who asked in a way that meant they actually wanted to know. What they all want at the end of it is for me to tell them something complete, some verdict, some clean accounting of what it meant. The honest answer is that it meant what it meant, and what it meant was a child said my name, and I said hers, and that was all it needed to be. The drive coil on the ardent passage got properly repaired at the waypoint, as it happened. The engineering team found 2 other components that were flagged while they were in there. We left the waypoint 4 days after we arrived, with a full hold of licensed medical supplies and a clean manifest, and the courier crafts registry suspended pending the corridor authority investigation. The notebook is in the medical bay shelf, above the secondary bunk, next to the plant. That is where it lives. There is one thing I left out of the account I give to most people, because it is the part that is hardest to explain without sounding like I am making a larger claim than I intend. It is also the part that is most true. On the 6th night, while the courier craft was running its observation track at the edge of our sensor range, and I was sitting in the medical bay chair in the way I had been sitting most nights, not sleeping, just occupying the space, the child woke up. She sat up on the bunk and she looked at the viewport for a while, and then she looked at me. I said in Kathai, the word for night, meaning, "It is still night, it is all right, you can sleep." She looked at me for another moment with those amber eyes that picked up the low running lights in the bay and turned them into something more than ambient. And then she held up the carved figure in both hands, the way you would hold something out to show it rather than to give it, and she said a word in Kathai that I did not know. I picked up the translation tablet. I asked her to say it again, and she said it again, slowly, in the way she had learned to do when she was trying to help me understand something. I found the word. It took me 3 attempts because the tonal marker on the second syllable was subtle and my ear was not yet good enough to separate it cleanly from the adjacent entry. But I found it. The word was the scifi word for a person who protects something valuable during the time between its loss and its return to the right hands. Not a keeper, not an owner. It was specifically the word for the transitional guardian, the one who holds the thing safe during the gap. In scifi cultural structure, this was an honored function. There were ceremonies around it, Ashali told me later. Obligations and reciprocal duties that ran in both directions. The child had given me a title, a formal one in her culture's vocabulary, with all the weight that carried. She set the carved figure back in her lap, and she lay down and she closed her eyes. I sat in the chair for a long time after that. I thought about the word for the one who holds the thread, and now this second word, the transitional guardian, and I thought about a child who had been in a crate, and had walked out of it with her carved figure still in her hand and her robe still twisted around her, and every piece of herself still intact, and who had, over 8 days and with no shared language and no certainty of outcome, constructed a complete and culturally precise accounting of what was happening, and what her relationship to the person responsible for her was. She was not a fragile thing. That is what I keep coming back to when I turn this over in memory. She was a child in a very bad situation with no power over her own circumstances, which is the definition of fragile. And she was the least fragile person I have been in a room with in 17 years of working in environments where most people are scared. Not because she was performing strength. She wasn't. She was 8 days out of a crate, and she was tired, and she was thin, and there were people following our ship, and none of that was hidden from her. She simply had a self that was not available to be taken, and she had a language for everything she was doing, and she had decided, with full knowledge of what she was deciding, to extend the thread. That is the part that is hardest to explain. That is also the part that I think about most. What the galaxy does when a small alien child ends up in human hands depends entirely on which human hands. I have been in enough places and seen enough of what those places do to children to know that the answer is not always what it should be, and that the version of this story where I made different choices in that secondary hold, where I calculated the risk differently, where I let the crate sit and reported it to the station authority and walked away from the problem. That version exists too, as a weight I am glad I do not carry. The child understood, I think, that the version she had was not the guaranteed one. She had been in the crate long enough to understand that. The thread was not an assumption. It was a choice she was making about a specific person based on specific evidence, evaluated in real time with nothing guaranteed. I was the evidence she was working from. A combat medic on a contraband freighter who ran unlicensed antibiotics for poor settlements and slept fine, who had given her water from a canteen and pushed it back when she tried to return it. That is the entire account. That is what she had. She decided it was enough. I have not always agreed with her assessment of me, but I have tried in the years since to be the person she decided I was. That seems like the right response to being handed that kind of trust. Not to earn it retroactively. You can't earn trust retroactively. The extension happened when it happened, and the ledger doesn't run backward. But to carry it forward, to let it be the measurement you hold yourself to. That is the honest accounting of what those 8 days cost, and what they gave me. A child said my name on a docking bay at the Austrian waypoint. I said hers. That was the whole of the transaction between us, and it was sufficient, and I have been living inside it ever since.